Good morning, or rather good afternoon at this point, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'm especially delighted to be able to welcome you all to this launch of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs Task Force Report, Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a New Imperative for U.S. Foreign Policy. Now, Rachel Bronson from the council to my left will give you a bit more background in just a few minutes on really what is a remarkable document, the fruit of more than a year of conversation among scholars, policymakers, and practitioners, many of whom are with us here today. I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate her, to congratulate Project Director Tom Wright, the task force members, the co-chair Scott Appleby and Rich Cizik, and also to recognize my colleague Eric Patterson, an assistant director here at the center, who's been a consultant on the project since its inception. This is really a great accomplishment. Religion and U.S. foreign policy are, as we all know, an explosive mix. It's a difficult, complex topic, rife not just with disagreement, but with moral, ethical, and emotional sensitivities. But I think we might all agree it's a topic too important to ignore, especially at this point in our country's history. And whatever the tensions, and you'll see some of them reflected in the conversation today and in the document itself, I think we might all agree on one thing, and that is that when it comes to religion and world affairs, we do have a knowledge deficit. We think we live, and we still do live to a large degree, in a world of economic interests, of security questions, of secular states and secular international institutions. But with every passing year, certainly over the past decade, and you can go even further back, I would suggest, issues of culture, issues of identity, and issues of religion have begun to intersect with that familiar global constellation in new ways, casting familiar policy challenges in a new light. And what this report helps us to do is to see this new world in a new way. It gives us some signposts. It also suggests practical ways forward for our government, for the Obama administration, for policymakers around the world. Whatever the issue area, economic and social development, democracy and human rights, questions of international security, engaging religious communities is, and this is really the message of the report, an imperative, a new and an old imperative in some sense for U.S. foreign policy. I'm delighted we can be part of this launch here at the Berkley Center. I'm going to resist the temptation to say really anything about the center. I do want to alert you, though, to an important event, sort of a sister event that we're doing next week. My colleague Tom Farr has organized a conference on the 3rd on proselytism and religious freedom, which looks to be a fascinating conversation. There's some more information about that at the back. Both that conference and this launch would not have been possible without the support of the Luce Foundation Initiative on Religion and International Affairs, and we have Toby Volkman and Terry Lautz here from the foundation, so thank you for being here. Thank you all for coming. This promises to be a very stimulating couple of hours, and without further ado, I want to turn it over to Rachel Bronson, congratulating her on the launch of the report, which will also be, I'm confident, the launch of a very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I do want to start off by thanking Tom and the Berkley Center for all of the work and support that they've put into this task force. Tom and Eric Patterson in particular have been really terrific in making our Washington conversations possible, as well as allowing us to call on such a large number of Berkley Center faculty for this task force. That's a big contribution for which we're greatly appreciative. And Eric Patterson really got this whole ball started in the beginning with heroic efforts and has stayed with us throughout the experience as a project consultant. So real meaningful support from the Berkley Center, for which we're greatly appreciative, not least of which is today. I also want to recognize we have a number of task force members in the reports, from the report sitting up front here. And I think I saw Tim Shaw come in back somewhere in there. There he is. Catherine Marshall, Tom Farr, we have Peter Seinfeld, Radwan Masmoudi, and I think there's some others throughout. So if I've missed you, I'm sorry, but please seek them out afterwards. Each of the task force members has probably slightly different views on all issues, but have managed to come together for this consensus document that the Chicago Council were very proud of. I also do want to thank Tom Wright, who's the Executive Director of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, as well as Alia Adamani sitting in the back, who was key to making this all happen. So without Tom and Alia, certainly we couldn't do this. Let me just take 2 minutes and talk to you about how this task force and why this task force came together, and then turn it over to the illustrious chairs and panelists today. At the Chicago Council, we're interested in obviously key events in foreign policies, key drivers of foreign policy in this new and challenging world in which we live. And we couldn't help but think about how religion and foreign policy comes together. Terry Lautz was in my office about 2.5 years ago. We had been doing a lot of work on immigration. Chicago is a portal for immigrants, and we'd done a lot on the Mexican community in Chicago, and then Muslim integration. And he had come to the office and said, well, what's next? And I think probably I was somewhat surprised. We turned around a proposal almost immediately, because this is the project I certainly wanted to work on. How do our leaders, our foreign policy leaders, our foreign service officers, how are they going to engage in a world in which religion is increasingly deprivatized, when it is very active in the public sphere, whereas in the past, U.S. foreign policy has kind of kept religion at a distance. It's a very hard issue for the U.S. to engage in. The Establishment Clause really gives people fear that they don't want to cross it. So how can they engage? Should we engage religion, and how? And from my view, of course we needed to, but the question was how, and what were the frameworks and the guidelines, and that's what I talked to each of the co-chairs in the beginning with. If we could offer a framework for this to U.S. Government officials, maybe we could do this a little bit better. And it is my hope, and I think our hope, that this task force report offers something that will be useful for those arguing that this kind of engagement is important. That is left to be seen, but is certainly our hope. A few facts to start us out. If you look at Africa in 1900, there were 10 million Christians in Africa. Now 400 million in Africa count themselves as Christians. Think of that change in a century. And I don't know that our foreign policy instruments or organization has changed at all to reflect that one mere fact on one important continent of this globe. My favorite statistic is that by 2050, China might be the most populous Christian and Muslim country on this planet. Are we structured to engage them with that kind of understanding? I don't think so yet. And then take The Economist in 2000 in their Millennium edition, their cover page. The cover of The Economist was "God is Dead." In 2009, the editor-in-chief with one of his senior colleagues comes back with a major book saying "God is back." So there's a real change that's going on, and an acknowledgement that the world, even in this last 10 years, for some looks very different from many of our task force members. This was a world that they are comfortable with and understand has a very important role, and religion has this important role for engagement, and we as a country could be a lot better if we engage more thoughtfully. So some background, I mentioned that we have task force members here. There were 32 task force members. We chose them across a number of sectors. We looked for religious leaders. We looked for policymakers. We looked for legal scholars. We looked for practitioners and academics so that we could come together in this very useful conversation. We had about 5 meetings, and we met over the phone over a course of 1.5 years. We have tremendous support from the Luce Foundation, for which we're very grateful, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who contributed this and put their stamp of approval saying that this was important. The current context in which we're operating today is very different, I think, than it was in the past few years. The U.S. government has come to understand that this is important. The CIA could not help but get focused on this issue when when it was running into al-Qaeda and violent political extremism and religious extremism abroad. The State Department couldn't help but get involved and think about this when they saw poll numbers dropping in the Muslim world for U.S. engagement. The Defense Department could not ignore this issue as it was engaged in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere. The U.S. government is coming to terms with this, but President Obama really put this on the map, following on his predecessors, Bush and Clinton, by this very important in June statement in Cairo. And I think what this means is now, instead of a conversation of us trying to convince an administration that religion is important, we have members of the administration here. The question is how? How do we engage? How do we do this? And a lot is very hard, and a lot of thinking is going into it. If we can be of help, we will be of service. So the goal is to provide a framework and a set of guidelines. So with that, probably longer than I intended, let me introduce you to the panel and explain how we're going to move forward. I'm going to turn it over to the two co-chairs who've really put in significantly more blood, sweat, and tears than I promised that they would have to, so for which I am exceedingly grateful. Scott Appleby is a professor of history and the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace and Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He is, of course, one of the leading figures in the field of religion and politics. He is the author and editor of 11 books, including the famous Ambivalence of the Sacred, Religion, Violence, and Reconciliation, and as well as a number of other books, including serving with Martin Marty as the editor of the award-winning series of volumes on global fundamentalism published by the University of Chicago. He was joined by the other co-chair, the Reverend Richard Cizik, who is now the president of the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. He is also an Open Society Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the United Nations Foundation. Previously, he served as 10 years, as I'm sure you all know, as the Vice President for Governmental Affairs at the National Association for Evangelicals. In 1996, he served as professional staff to the Religious Leaders Delegation to the People's Republic of China at the invitation of President Clinton. And in 2008, he was named to Time Magazine's list of the Time 100 for his efforts in the Evangelical Climate Initiative and his collaborative efforts to bring religion and science into conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Richard first and then Scott, but then we're going to turn it for a conversation to E.J. Dionne, who's a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture here at Georgetown. And those of you from Georgetown well know that one of the key reasons that he is here today is his real commitment to the university, for which is really a tremendous commitment, and I'm sure you should all be happy with, but we're delighted to have him. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and a syndicated columnist, of course, for the Washington Post. He is the series co-editor of the Pew Forum Dialogues on Religion and Public Life, and has also edited and co-edited a number of other works, including What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment, and Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right. And then to clean up at the end, Afifa Saeed is the Senior Advisor for Cultural and Development with the Middle East and Asia Bureaus at USAID. We're delighted that Afifa's here as the U.S. government thinks through these issues. She's really an important asset to us thinking through about not only the challenges of getting this right, but what the U.S. government is doing. So with that, I thank you for coming today, and let me quickly turn it over to Richard Cizik.
Thank you, Rachel. What a delight it is to be here and to have you all come out. Thank you very much. I was reminded when Rachel and Tom talked about the past that we didn't know really what would happen. Maybe Scott was more optimistic. I looked at the diversity of the scholars involved and said, now, where is this going to go? From people who are political conservatives to political liberals, Christian evangelicals, whereas Muslims, across the spectrum. We even included some Catholics. That's for their moral theology and all the rest that they offer to us. When I was, just very briefly, I want to lay a little bit of the foundations for the recommendations that Scott will enunciate. In other words, the foundations that rest upon, in so many ways, what we know, in so many ways intuitively, but what we haven't intellectually always put together. And so, by way of background, I want to add just one personal anecdote. As a young man, I grew up in a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community in eastern Washington state. I don't know that it was but one African American and maybe a few Latinos in those days that were my friends. I traveled overseas for the first time after having come to graduate school in Washington, D.C. in 1974 to China, and lived in a Chinese Buddhist home. It was my first experience cross-culturally, religiously, and believe me, I never would have imagined that the experiences I had then, but for all of us, those experiences of the past, I believe, predict the future. In fact, the Dalai Lama said that just a few days ago in Washington. The experiences that we've had, we bring to this task. And I want to say my appreciation to everyone here, but a foundation, it's my experience. I've left the religious world after 25 years and have entered the foundation and the think tank world. And I was reminded of this reality and the difficulties sometimes of challenging conventional thinking by an article that ran in this weekend's New York Times piece called Brain Mistrust, in which the writer says that scholars are prone to generate mountains of policy ideas to buttress their own party's core philosophies, but rarely do they provoke any fundamental or necessarily, and sometimes divisive, rethinking of how that philosophy works in a new century. And I want to commend, because the Chicago Council has done that, I think some really forward new thinking about how we do this matter of religion. That by way of background and a commendation. The overview I want to share with you is this, a number of key points. It's not new to you, but the salience of religion is increasing. Religious communities are pivotal players, from counterinsurgency to development, peace building to stewardship of the environment. Whereas it was once, as we know, considered private matter, Western policymakers, that's how they viewed religion. It is now playing an increasingly influential role in so many ways, both positive and negative. And I don't need to recount them, but you know as well as I do that religious activism was behind the 9/11 attacks, but also the fall of the Berlin Wall. It fuels bloody communal conflict in Bosnia and Sudan, but also peace and forgiveness in South Africa and Northern Ireland. It's motivated the politics of Osama bin Laden, and violent Hindu nationalists, but see also Pope John Paul II and the Dalai Lama. It's pivotal at this key point in history to the fate of Afghanistan, India, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Yemen, and many other locales where the United States has vital foreign policy interests. And so the salience of religion is what fundamentally undergirds our report and its rising importance as a driver in its own right. See, not just as an epiphenomenal factor on the side or the margins, but central as a driver in what's happening. And though it has been viewed, as Rachel said, as a negative factor, a factor associated, you see, with violence, we can't view it today, the report says, solely through the lens of counterterrorism policy. And that focus, we say, is too narrow and poorly understood. And so it's in a broader sense that we want to communicate the role that religion now plays in the world, on the political scene as well, and the contributions that it can make, which have altogether too often been undervalued and overlooked. And without a framework for engagement, the United States will be absent from global community conversations, crucial conversations that need to occur. Opportunities will be missed and threats may worsen. Cairo was a very important statement, but more needs to be done. I like to quote President Obama. Here's what he said. He recognized in the speech the engaging of communities, economically and politically, influential sectors of society, including religious communities, he said. This is what he said is important and follows efforts you see by both the Clinton and Bush administrations to profile religious engagement. And yet while the Cairo speech was important and influential, it's just a start. And it doesn't in so many ways lay out the future. It's cast a vision, but the question is, what will the strategy be? Whether or not, the question is, the U.S. can build on the lessons of the last 8 years in order to craft a sustainable and an effective strategy to address the role of religion. And that's what we're about here. That's, I think, the most fundamental of questions. The patterns you can look at, they're laid out. They include the influence of religious groups on all sectors of society, business and science, as well as politics and culture. Number two, the changing patterns of religious identification are having significant political implications. We know that. Religion is not epiphenomenal. That is a secondary human experience that has no bearing on politics or political development that we can ignore. It plays an important public role where governments lack capacity and legitimacy, particularly where we have weak states, we know, even failed states. And religion can be a conflict escalator. And this can occur in part from the way in which it intersects with other global developments. For instance, the Sunni-Shia conflict in Iraq was well known to exist, but it became politically relevant on a global level when it was put into the mix of Al-Qaeda. And so religion can thus become a conflict escalator. If you look in the report, we cite numerous instances. One of those that particularly I reference and ask the report to include the way in which, for example, American evangelical engagement on Israel has been used at times to be a conflict escalator and to deny, I think, the peace process that ought to go forward in that part of the world. Growing salience of religion also deepens the political significance of religious freedom. And we'll look at the aspects of that in the future, but as we converse. But Obama put it this way. He said, people should be free to choose and live their faith based upon the persuasion of the mind, heart, and the soul. And yet we know the fact is that religious freedom has been used, in ways that overseas people believe this is something a part of, what would be a Christian crusade or Western imperialism. And so the logical question then is, how does it play a role rightly? That is religious freedom. Why should it matter to the United States government? We do here? Well, we know the United States government has on only an episodic level, an infrequent level, and sometimes ill-considered, engaged with religion. The challenges that we face are global. Rogue regimes, terrorism, pandemics. But the context, we say, is local and the key actors are often religious. Finally, let me say the three strategic strategies that we, and challenges that we enunciate in the report are: one, the need to maintain long-term health of bilateral alliances while supporting liberalization in countries where the likely winner of elections is anti-American. And we deal specifically with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a case example. And we know, for example, the foundation of U.S. security depends on our alliances, but at times those alliances come in conflict with our deeply felt views about the need for democratization and human rights. And so these two elements, U.S. security alliances and democratization, we point out in the report, these two elements are sometimes in conflict. You well know that. And so we say a second strategic challenge is to promote human rights, but in a way that is not perceived as an assault on local faith and custom. And we've always been known as a nation that supports human rights. And yet, as I said earlier, the emphasis on advocacy of human rights and religious freedom are perceived in some parts of the world as part of an anti-religious or pro-Christian imperialist strategy by Western powers. And so how do we do it in a way that it's not perceived as an assault? That's the second main strategic challenge. The third is the need to marginalize extremists without counterproductive involvement in intra-religious debates. this, I think, will challenge us as much as anything in the coming years. Religions are not monolithic, we say in the report, nor are the political movements they inspire. And so how do we practice this engagement, religious engagement, in ways that are not perceived as simply the manipulation of religious groups? We can talk about that here. In sum, the strategic assumption of this report is that promoting a rigidly secular alternative to the religious element of world politics will be ineffective and may make things worse. Let me repeat that again. Promoting a religiously secular alternative to the religious element of world politics will be ineffective and make things worse. And so, back to the earlier question, can we do something that will be sustainable and effective to address the role of religion in the world of the 21st century? And we believe that we have a strategy and a framework that does work, and I'll turn that over to my friend Scott to talk about it. I would say, Scott, you've heard me say this before, but a vision for this religious engagement, like any other vision without a strategy, is an hallucination. Sure. And so the question is, are we hallucinating here?
I'm going to leave that question aside for the moment, Richard. I want to quickly open with thanks to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for taking on this difficult and sometimes thorny topic. Commend them for doing that. To the Luce Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation for supporting the initiative. To Richard, my colleague and friend, to all the members of the task force who contributed, and also to all of you for turning out today for this discussion. This is sometimes an unwieldy and difficult topic. How to engage religion? That is a complicated question because we know, as Richard was outlining, that there is no such thing as religion, of course. There's no Islam, there's no Christianity, there's no Buddhism. There are Islams and Christianities and Judaisms and Buddhisms. These worldwide religious traditions are internally plural. Religion has always been contested. Muslims fight Muslims, Christians, Jews, more than they fight other people, and they always have, because they're always interpreting sacred texts and sources that are ambiguous to some degree and admit of multiple interpretations. They're fragmented. There are different schools and branches. None of that is new. Neither is syncretism, mixing and blending and matching across religious traditions within them with philosophical or secular traditions. All of that is as old as religion itself. It goes back millennia. What we see today, though, is the impact of globalization among other important factors. Globalization isn't new either, as you know, but the rapidity of it, the dynamism of it, the pervasiveness of it, this is new. And this has impact on religion. It makes religion a much more complicated, interesting, potentially fruitful, potentially destructive phenomenon than it already is. This means globalization does that national boundaries and borders don't mean what they used to mean. It means that religious affiliation is changing, that not only through intermarriage across religious divides, whether they're denominational or traditional or otherwise, but also through incredibly close contact and exchange across religious communities in any particular state. Boundaries of time, space, and so on are no longer what they used to be, and that means the fluidity of religion is increasing it in ways that none of us really can keep up with. This makes it an exciting phenomenon to study and interact with, but also a daunting one. So when we recognize that we want to talk today about engaging religious communities, and to do so as part of U.S. foreign policy, we begin with a recognition that we're not talking about an it here, or about one thing, or one movement, or one religious tradition, or multiple ones, but about internally complex and plural traditions themselves, making it all more complicated. So, my role today, very briefly, is to just indicate in summary fashion what the major recommendations and overall orientation of those recommendations are within a very tightly written, but still 92, relatively small, but still 92 pages that you can read for yourselves. So this is going to be a sketch, but I'm going to try to hit high points. But we recognize that there are so many challenges to making recommendations for government, qua government, to engage religion. And furthermore, we're arguing in this report, as Rachel indicated initially, not that we're recommending engaging religious majority states or regimes. We already do that in government. How do we think about engaging communities? And that's going to mean automatically, and the report emphasizes this, that government has to take the lead and should take the lead in certain sectors, but that this is also a non-governmental enterprise. It involves civil society here and abroad. It involves non-governmental organizations, the private sector, business, higher education, relief and development organizations, as well as government. And that's stressed throughout the report. When we do talk about those principles of engagement, government and non-governmental, when we begin, I'm going to emphasize 3 areas of the recommendation, clusters, so to speak. The first, I'm just going to use the catchword religious literacy. We have to improve our religious literacy in this country, governmentally, non-governmentally. By religious literacy, I don't mean everyone needs a PhD in religious studies, God forbid, or that we're talking about theoretical or book knowledge. What we're really talking about is the phenomenon of lived religion. What goes on in local communities around the world when sacred texts and traditions and prophets and rabbis and priests translate and adapt those traditions and arguments and contestations at the local level on a daily basis. Lived religion. How does that interact with culture more broadly, politics, society, everything from how we think about raising our children to spending money to relationships with the so-called others? So what we need is a deeper, nuanced understanding across the whole of government, is the phrase we would use, and beyond, of lived religion and the impact it has in sectors from development, as we mentioned, religious communities around the world in Africa. Catherine Marshall will know the statistics and the details on our task force report better than anyone, but Christian and Muslim groups together combine, some say, to offer up to 40% of healthcare services and delivery sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about women's rights. You want to understand what the progress is on women's rights? Well, if you ignore religious communities who engage both for good and for ill on that question, we're going to be out of the conversation. The same is true of conflict transformation and mitigation, questions about resources, environment, education for the young. We have to engage on a community-to-community basis, and to do that, we have to understand religion in a much more sophisticated way than we do, because we've been beset throughout the Cold War and up until recently with a kind of secular myopia in government. You know that we've privatized religion in our own lives in this country, and our approach to understanding religion has been to say, gee, that's complicated, church-state separation, it's messy, can't we just leave that alone? And we've been under-tutored across the board. Now that's changed, and the report spells out the positive steps that have been taken in improving religious literacy in the last 10 years since 9/11, with some buildup prior to that. But what we're calling for in the report, in this first of the 3 clusters I'll mention, is a coordinated effort across whole of government to increase our understanding of lived religion. And we call for the National Security Council to coordinate. It's a relatively small office, but it's close to the president and can coordinate efforts not only in state and defense, where one would expect we need greater and deeper sophistication in religion, but also in health and human services, in Department of Education and energy, across the board, whole of government. Because if we're going to engage community to community, include civil society, I'll mention how important diplomacy will be in a moment, but not merely at the most elite level, the governmental level. All of these agencies have to come up to speed in terms of our foreign service, ambassadors, diplomats, special envoys, who have to have some basic, or have people with them in these regions and countries who understand the nuances, the lived experience of people on the ground. In order to do that, there's a lot of particular recommendations that are included in the report for how to approach that, including what I find very interesting and creative. It's not unique to us. Tom Friedman has written about it. There's been a lot of discussion about it. But we have a resource of people who've been on the battlefront in Iraq and Afghanistan, our military and civilian leaders there who have real firsthand knowledge of what it means to engage lived religion, to understand not only the difference between Sunni and Shia, but which cleric in the Shia world, which Ayatollah, which religious leader really understands this sector of the society and has influence. How do we interact with local religious actors? We have people returning from those fronts who have had firsthand experience at important levels. We need to integrate them into the educational mission. That's one of the recommendations. So there is quite a bit across the board in the report about how do we engage, beginning with a whole of government approach in improving our nuanced understanding of the complicated religious dynamics in so many theaters and societies around the world that we want to engage intelligently. A second area to mention is, and this is just one of several, but what are the impediments to engaging communities in a sophisticated way, governmentally, non-governmentally? One of them in the past has been the assumption that many in government have held, apparently, that it's forbidden to engage religion. And it's forbidden precisely by the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. That we just cannot effectively, as governmental agencies or representatives, engage religious communities for fear of violating church-state separation, quote unquote, and other provisions that seem to be interpreted under the Establishment Clause. This is erroneous. It is not an impediment to engaging religious communities. We come out unanimously in the report to ask the President to clarify that the Establishment Clause does not prohibit government engagement with religious communities around the world. There is some disagreement in the report about a subpoint under this question about clarifying the Establishment Clause. Namely, are the means by which governmental agencies engage people working in development, in healthcare, in conflict transformation, in these local communities and in these national communities, are the means of that engagement constrained under the Establishment Clause? And the majority of folks in the report believe, following the legal experts, constitutional experts on the task force, that there well may be constraints that need to be clarified, whereas other people on the report think it really is not productive to begin to ask about constraints because it's enough to say, and it's appropriate to say, that the Establishment Clause does not constrain engagement. So we have difference of emphasis about how to interpret the application, but we're completely unanimous that it ought to be clarified across government agencies. It ain't forbidden to engage religion. Okay, so thank you. So that's the second. I'd be happy for many here's at any time I conclude, if you don't mind. My third and final of my cluster of recommendations, and again I'm skimming the surface, is on the question of religious freedom. Which is part of our recommendations, because we have recommendations for the National Security Council, I've mentioned, also for the President, among other non-governmental organizations. We have ideas and all kinds of suggestions. We're asking the President to move with dispatch to name an ambassador at large for religious freedom. That position is unfilled. It was established in the International Religious Freedom Act under the Clinton administration, and there have been, as you know, ambassadors for religious freedom. The Obama administration, we're asking, needs to appoint, not merely to appoint an ambassador, that's important, but to appoint an ambassador who can address a real challenge in lifting up religious freedom as an important universal human right and a right guaranteed in our Constitution, which the task force agrees, I think unanimously, is a very important element of any kind of engagement policy. The question is, how do we engage on the question of religious freedom? And as Richard mentioned, there's controversy about this because religious freedom is sometimes used in scare quotes by people who oppose it, and they're scared of it. That is, religious freedom doesn't mean to open up the public square to majority as well as minority religions. Instead, what it means, some are worried, it's a mask for U.S. foreign policy that is an attempt to to advance narrowly conceived U.S., read that, Christian, or worse for some, Judeo-Christian interest in not only the Muslim world, but in India, in China, and elsewhere. So religious freedom has unfortunately become distorted and misconstrued as a narrow and cynical policy tool or weapon to advance narrowly conceived, culturally driven, religiously driven U.S. interests. This is not what we mean by religious freedom. It's not what IRFA meant by religious freedom. It's not what our Constitution means. Instead, what we mean by religious freedom is the freedom for religious groups, whether they're in the majority or the minority within a state, because majority religious communities are also persecuted and repressed by states. And we are calling for the ambassador at large to be appointed to work hard to clarify and to move forward for ways that assure that a robust engagement on the question of religious freedom understands it appropriately, which is to welcome into the public square a variety of public actors, whether they're from a majority or minority religious community, who play within the rule of law and who observe the rules of civil nonviolent discourse, and as a result, enhance religious pluralism, which, as we know from many studies and experiences, is a key to democratization. It's also a way to temper religious extremism or to identify the religious extremists who refuse to play by the rules. We want more religious expression in these communities, not less. We sometimes can shake our head about our own country with its religious this and religious that and so much. We've got Catholics up here and evangelicals and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and what else, and they just don't shut up, and that's a wonderful thing. Because since they have that ability to organize in the public square, they're in the public square, we're not yet throwing a lot of real bombs, and we're not yet shooting one another for the most part, God forbid, precisely because there's an open public square, and this is a key part of engaging communities. We want to support them. Final thing I'll say about this is, one of the questions, what do you do when you're engaging religious actors, and these include anti-American, violent extremists, those prone to it. There are 6 criteria set forth by a previous task force report led by Madeleine Albright, principles for engaging hostile groups. And those we found very sound. We repeated them and endorsed them in the report. And because we don't think it's prudent to completely isolate any kind of somewhat complicated, internally plural, even negative or hostile religious movement, when in fact there are elements within it that can be usefully engaged under certain circumstances. We're not naive about who we want to engage. We're shrewd about it. So in summary, we're looking for a framework and we're providing a framework, we hope, and some policy directions for engagement through religious literacy across the board, whole of government, through clarifying the openness within our constitutional system to shrewd and smart engagement, governmentally, non-governmentally, universities, civil society, and the like. And not least, we want to clarify and strengthen the presence of religious freedom while not having it backfire for us or for others around the world because it's misunderstood or it's misused or misappropriated. We want to be very sensitive to that as well.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to turn it over to EJ. Before I do, for those of you in the room, I'm sure most of you here who've written long reports or books or articles, you know that the hardest thing to do is come up with the bumper sticker on the car, and people ask you to do that, and that's probably the hardest thing of any report. And I think Scott just gave it to us in the "It Ain't Forbidden to Engage Religion." So that could have been the topic, the title of this report, maybe had we thought of it a few weeks back. But so with that, let me turn it over to EJ.
Scott also just spoke the most true statement ever said at or about Washington panels. They just don't shut up. So thank you. Thank you very much. I want to begin just by saying that I had an experience while I was reading this excellent report, and I was drawn to a bookshelf in my house. And I had recently heard that, although it's been true for a while, that Father Andrew Greeley is quite ill. And so he was on my mind, and I pulled off my shelf a very old book. This book was published in 1972, and it's a book called Unsecular Man, and the subtitle is The Persistence of Religion. This is 40 years ago, and I just want to read a couple of sentences written in the classic pugilistic Greeley style. Those of you who know Father Greeley, the very first sentence of the book: "Let us be clear at the beginning, this is a volume of dissent. It rejects most of the conventional wisdom about the contemporary religious situation." And of course, at that time, the contemporary view among sociologists like Father Greeley was dominated by the secularization thesis. Religion was going away. This was inevitable. Greeley said otherwise. The thesis of this book, bluntly, he did have to say that, is that the basic human religious needs and the basic religious functions have not changed very notably since the late Ice Age. What changes have occurred make religious questions more critical rather than less critical in the contemporary world. I do wish Father Greeley were well enough to be in this crowd and say, "I told you so." And again, if you know Father Greeley, you know he would. About the only people at that time who agreed with him are people like Tom Farr, Gene Elstein, but they were in grade school then, so they don't count. So I speak here in honor of Father Greeley, and I also want to note that, again, those of you who know him know that next to God, I think he loved the city of Chicago most. He loves the city of Chicago most. So he'd be very excited that it was the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations that convened this today. And I suggest you look at the book and look at the people they have brought together. And I was trying to think of the right way to describe them, and a dear friend of mine who is an ardent Red Sox fan, as I am, would say that the only team you can imagine that's better than this one is made up of all the players the Red Sox have traded over the years. So this is an extraordinary group. I also...
Or fired.
Yeah, there's that. The other two things I want to say before I begin, one is the Berkley Center. The Berkley Center is a real blessing to this university. We are very grateful that they're here, both because of the work that they do in the world on behalf of understanding these questions and on behalf of religious liberty, but also for the fact that they put this Jesuit Catholic university at the center of some of the most important discussions going on. I was seeing Tom Farr and Tom Banchoff, the two Toms, St. Thomas the Apostle, St. Thomas Aquinas. You can fight over which is which, but I salute you and all the people at the Berkley Center. And Lord knows, Scott Appleby and Rich Cizik are two of my favorite people. They're people I have admired for a very long time. I'm in their debt. And they are two people who for a long time have been warning against, Scott used the term, secular myopia. And they're also people who have been able to look inward critically. I'm not talking about themselves, but at their own traditions, and had a very lively relationship with their own traditions, which is one of the most important parts of this discussion, even though we often focus on inter-religious dialogue. This is a very vexed area, and that's why this is such a fine report. I think everyone commits intellectual sins when they approach this question. Almost all positions, I think, are troubled by tensions and contradictions. I think we veer from underestimating to overestimating the role of religion in international affairs. We sometimes write off religion's role as artificial, a cover for national or ethnic or class or personal interests. But sometimes we so emphasize religion that we fail to acknowledge those circumstances in which it actually is a cover for national or ethnic or class or personal interests. Those friendly to religion, when confronted with the barbarous acts that are committed at times in the name of religion, often downplay the role of faith, see these acts as extraneous to faith. Those hostile to religion, those hostile to faith, use such barbarous acts to condemn all religion, or they argue that religion is always and everywhere subject to manipulation because it is fundamentally irrational. I think that what's powerful about this report is all of these sins that are committed routinely in this area really call us to a kind of balance. And this report, I think, offers that kind of balance and clear thinking, and it is the beginning, I think, of a really good quest for a proper response to these matters as a matter of intellectually and as a matter of policy. Now, the biggest problem with this report was described to me by Peter Steinfels just when we were talking. The biggest problem is that the world has been catching up to this report. And so you'll notice some little footnotes. They had recommendations in here that the government actually already has, our American government has already carried out. So they really had to get this published fast before the government adopted all the recommendations, before they even put out the report. I just want to offer a couple of caveats. I'm thinking of the word because of the passing of Al Haig. Either caveats or perhaps sort of areas where I think there are still challenges left. And then I want to underscore a couple areas where I particularly I agree with the studies. First, I think we need to be candid that we are having this discussion in large part because of the rise of certain radical forms of Islam that we see as threatening to our interests and our security. Now, there are plenty of people, especially people in this room, who have been interested in this subject and have known that that religious concerns were vital to international affairs for a long time. But I think we need to face the fact that we are having this discussion because of recent challenges. Much as some of us believed in the importance of this before 9/11, that engaging all religious groups around the world was important before 9/11. This is a fact that hovers, I think, over the report. The authors say rightly that the focus of American interest in these matters should go beyond the Muslim world to encompass religious communities more broadly, and I think that's absolutely true. But the report itself keeps coming back to Islam, and I think it's helpful to be candid about how much our focus right now really is on Islam. We shouldn't allow that to constrain us. We shouldn't not do other things or look at other things. We certainly shouldn't parody Islam itself. We want to understand Islam in all its richness and complexity, but I think we just need to face that. There is another tension that I saw in the report between our desire to be respectful to other cultures and traditions and the insistence of many of us on international universal standards of human and religious rights. On page 12 of the report, as I think it's still page 12, there is a sentence that reads, "This includes articulating religious freedom in a way that is not viewed as imperialism, but as a means to support religious agency, to undermine religion-based terrorism, and to promote stable democracy." Now, obviously, I agree with that sentence, but I do think that at some point, all advocates of religious freedom need to accept the imperative. Either there are universal standards or there are not universal standards. I think we do need to insist on universal standards, knowing, and I get back to this, that there are many ways of upholding religious liberty. There are many forms, constitutional forms, that guarantee religious freedom. But I think that there is a tension here between respect for other cultures and a kind of cultural relativism that I don't think we want to apply when we're talking about certain standards of human rights. The report calls for serious efforts to reconcile democratization and our need to build alliances. And again, I agree with every word that the authors write in this report. They are quite right that our support for authoritarian regimes can hurt us in the long run. Yet I really worry that there are very hard calls to make in these areas where the two objectives may not be reconcilable, where we face only bad choices of supporting deeply flawed regimes on the one hand, or encouraging their replacements by regimes that might be equally flawed but hostile to our interests. I think here of Isaiah Berlin, who taught us about agonistic choices, and he often spoke about choices between competing goods, but you also have choices between competing, if not evils, then not so goods. And I think that this is a very difficult area. I do not myself have a consistent set of principles in such cases. My deepest personal instincts are to support democratization everywhere, all of the time. But I think there's a tension here, and I think that the report, does not answer this tension, but you can't ask it to do all the work in 92 pages. But I think that it calls us to a deeper dialogue on this very, very difficult question. Just a couple of things I want to underscore that I particularly admire in the report. I have it on pages 72 and 73. There's a recommendation, reaffirm the U.S. commitment to religious freedom while clarifying the meaning of the term. There's one other recommendation at a university I have to call attention to. It says everybody should know more about this. I read that as the Professor of Religion's Full Employment Act of 2010. I am all in favor of this. But let me go back. Reaffirm the U.S. commitment to religious freedom while clarifying the meaning of that term. I have really been instructed on this by my friend, the distinguished political theorist, Bill Galston. We really have to understand that there are many different ways of doing religious liberty. I think the American temptation is to say that only a particularly Jeffersonian church-state separation understanding, and Lord knows we have arguments among ourselves over whether church-state separation is even the proper way to understand our own First Amendment, that's the only way to do it. Well, we already know that there are multiple paths to religious liberty. There are different ways in which different societies achieve religious liberty. Our form, if you will, of pluralism is actually more friendly to the expressions of religion in the public square than the French form of laïcisme. So there's already some difference just between us and the French. There are many paths to religious freedom, and I salute the authors of this report for underscoring that. And then you also talk about the importance of engaging religious political parties abroad and not being so wary of that. And I've got to say, all I could think of is we think this is brand new. The United States of America practically financed the victory of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy in the 1948 elections because we were trying to keep the communists out of power. I'm not sure I recommend that particular approach. I don't want to get into an argument about the Cold War and that particular election. But we also supported and had a rich dialogue with Christian Democratic parties across Latin America. Eduardo Frei, the old man, is one of my heroes from my childhood. This is a great tradition. So we have already had this form of engagement in the past. We shouldn't be put off that it now requires us to engage with other kinds of religious parties that aren't necessarily Christian or within traditions that we understand with. So I particularly support that. Two other points I want to make. One is I love the dissent at the end. First of all, no report is any good without a dissent. And I'm drawn naturally to the dissents, especially these days, given the way Supreme Court decisions are going. I almost always agree with the dissents. And I must say I had a Clintonian reaction to that little debate at the end of the report. A Clintonian defined here as in Bill Clinton, as in, well, I think you're kind of both right about this. Why can't we all get along? On the one hand, I think that the dissenters, if you will, Jean and some of her friends, are right to say that there's nothing in this report that I can see that actually raises any questions with the First Amendment. And there is an enormous amount that can be done without worrying about the Establishment Clause. On the other hand, when I read my friend David Saperstein, my other friend David Saperstein on the other side, I do think there is no way to engage these questions without, in the end, coming back to how this affects us here in the United States, that there are ways, once the American government gets engaged in these areas, it almost necessarily raises issues. So I guess I'm with the majority in the middle that says we can do all this stuff and the president needs to clarify it. But we know how much we all like to argue about the meaning of the First Amendment, so I'm glad that this report reflects that robust American tradition and may that debate continue. I want to just close by saying this. When confronted by difficult choices, diplomats and really all the rest of us, even when we are non-believers, often exclaim the words, God help us. And I think this report shows that thinking about those words, God help us, may actually be a wise, prudent, and realistic guide to approaching some of the most difficult and challenging international policy issues of our time. And I salute the authors of the report for putting those words in our heads. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, EJ. Let me turn it now to Afifa to talk about it from her vantage point of sitting on it and representing us abroad. Afifa, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for everything, for the report and for having this panel, and I think especially for having USG, not just as part of the audience, and there are quite a few out here, but also being a part of the discussion. I could make this really quick and sweet and short and say amen to the report, and that it's not only is it well done and well written, but obviously has some food for thought for all of us. I do want to put a disclaimer out first, though, and that is that I'm not an academic. I'm an anthropologist, and a cultural anthropologist at that. And I have an applied degree, so I'm much, much more in the weeds. And my degree was in cultural anthropology with a focus on grassroots development. So I'm actually out in the field much more than I am not, which is a good thing, except for my kids who have more space than they want sometimes. But what I really wanted, the frame that I wanted to give us as far as this discussion goes, is what is the U.S. government doing? What are we doing in those bureaucratic halls that are sometimes impenetrable? And yes, there have been pretty good stereotypes of those bureaucrats. Those of us that are closed-minded, we're ad hoc, we are disengaged, and we could also be, as far as U.S. aid, the people with the check, and we're the donors, so we just go out and do this, give out money or give out policies and not really engage. And in fact, when I started at USAID, which was in 2008, when I started talking about some of these issues of religion and so on, this is what I heard, which was, Afifa, we have to program in every country as if we're programming in the US. And this was their take on engaging with religion. And that was in 2008, it wasn't too long ago. But what has happened since, and what has happened incrementally, but I think very significantly to the point where it could become profound, is from there to now, all the things that you have put in the report, we were going through it almost like a checklist. We're saying, hey, we've had that conversation, we've had this discussion, we've had this interaction, and we've had those of us that are here from the agencies, whether it's State Department or USAID, and I don't know if there's somebody here from White House, but we've had a lot of these conversations in a very interesting way, which is to say, and this is what I'm really excited about, is my position, which is Advisor for Culture and Development, was created because the missions in the field were saying, we need more expertise. The missions in the field, this is back in 2006 and 2007 when they were thinking about this at USAID, we need to understand the very dynamic context that we are working with, increasingly dynamic. This is what field was saying. So the position that I'm in, and many of my colleagues that are doing similar type of work, we're proud to say that this was not a top-down, this was a bottom-up. This is people saying we need a better understanding. So this idea of what is the internal will within the USG, what's already happening that people are interested or excited, and I started with saying that I was told that we had to program as if we're in the US, which just didn't make sense. And when I'd go back into the field and say, hey, have you guys heard this? And they'd say, not only is that ridiculous, but that's not what we're doing. We are doing work that is relevant and that it's important, but we need better expertise to do it. So we started discussing more the value of engagement. And what does engagement mean? We had to really just talk about engagement in a way that we hadn't talked about before. And this is, again, starting in 2008, or 2006 even, for some of us that have been at it longer. So it's talking about terminology and doing it slowly and doing it almost gently was really the word that I could use in many cases. It's not about, well, here's what needs to be done and has to be done, because if you really want things to take hold in a bureaucratic stuff that we have, it has to come incrementally, it has to be understood in a way that makes sense. So creating the will itself was based on what are the concepts, what are the notions, what are the ideas we're dealing with. So I've had these very interesting conversations, whether they're in missions, and I've stayed at PRTs in Afghanistan, and I've worked with chaplains as well as state folks and USAID in PRTs about engagement with religious actors. So what I want to put out more than anything else is that these conversations have been had at a very, very grassroots level. And the reason the conversations are being had is because people understand. And people that want to do good development, for example, in my case, understand that engagement will equal better development. It doesn't mean that engagement will just be a nice thing to do. That's not always easy to come across. It's not always something that people understand. But it's something that we've been working through, and we're getting to that point. Now, once you get the will and the understanding of why it's important, the next step that we're working on now actively across many different agency organizations is the capacity to deal with this. It's nice to say, yeah, we need better engagement, and people bought it and are excited about it, but then how do we do it? So we've created, for example, training. We have training in our conflict and mitigation office at USAID, which is programming in religious context. I brought a visual aid for you all. This is a booklet or a toolkit that goes with that training. It's religion, conflict, and peace building. So it's all about creating not just the space to talk about it, but then what do we do with that talk? What do we do with those conversations? So that this training that's developed my colleagues there, they unravel a lot of this through the training. And this is all internal training. It's all stuff we're doing inside. We've had 2 pilots already, and we've had 2 full trainings that have included all of USG. It's been open. And it's interesting because in those conversations, we have folks saying, as we hear, we've never been able to talk about these things within the USG. Not only have we been not able to, we've been reticent, we've been hesitant, we've been scared to talk about them. And I remember when I first started talking about these issues coming from outside of USG, people were a little anxious. But I want to give you an example of a really interesting experience I had, which was, we're putting together panels and discussions and so on internally on these issues. So I had one, and it was called Spiritual Transformation and Conflict, and it was specifically focusing on water conflict. And I told Aaron Wolf, who's coming from Oregon State, I said, Aaron, I don't know who's going to show up. It might be just you and me here. The room was full. And it was just like this. People were, walking out the door, and they were very interested, not just in what Aaron had to say, but the ability to be able to talk about this within the safe walls of this conference room. And so and I'll just give you a quick example of that discussion, which was Aaron said he was working with conflict situation in India over water, over a river, and so he had the 2 villages come together, and this is development speak, right? So he had 2 villages come together to resolve the conflict, and they sat together, and lo and behold, one of the chairs at the table was empty. And Aaron said, what's that for? And they said, that's for the river god. The river deity has to be at the table when we resolve this conflict. So I watched to see what all of this USAID employees in that room, how they were going to react. And one of them put up her hand, she says, and she gave an example of the exact same thing that had happened to her in a Catholic setting, where it was a deity that had to be involved, well, the deity, but in terms of, the spiritual connection that the person had with the conflict. So, of course, the conversation is going to be different if the deity's at the table, right? It's going to be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more understandable. But the reason I'm giving this very specific example is for a few things. One is to say that we had that conversation in the Middle East conference room at USAID, and the second to say that the room was full of people that wanted to talk about it, and the third to say those folks that are working in conflict take that back to their office, and they start doing something with this nugget that they have just experienced. And they start talking to Aaron more and more about, tell us about this water conflict situation and how spiritual transformation has an effect or has something to do with this. So that's to give you the dynamics of what's happening. Now, that didn't make headlines, and it definitely wasn't a press release that we put out that we're having these kind of conversations. And in fact, telling you about it is giving you a little bit of insight into our internal conversations. But that's what's happening, and that's what's going on. One of the things that we've set up with my colleagues here from state is a religion and global affairs working group. We set it up, it must have been early last year. And again, we bring folks from State Department, from USAID, and whomever else is interested, because we put it out there, to talk about these issues. So we had a viewing of Inside Islam, What a Billion Muslims Think, last year at the State Department. And we had a lot of people come, I can't remember, it was in the hundreds. And people came and they talked about the issues. We took that film, which is about perceptions of Muslims and so on. It's based on the Gallup poll. And I've taken it to each mission. And now many of the missions, USAID missions, have that film. But it's not just the importance of having the film. We came up with a list of discussion questions that go with the film. And the questions are, what does development mean? And how do we do better development if we take into consideration what folks are thinking? I mean, it's an aha moment for some people, and for some people it's like, duh, how would we not take into consideration? But this is what it's all about, is unraveling what is out there that we don't already engage in, but understanding that people have the will, they just don't necessarily have the tools. One of the discussions, we had a mission directors conference in December where we had every mission director there, and it was like the UN. It was just a very moving experience, actually. They were all in the same room, and my presentation was about culture matters, and why culture is something that we need to, cultural competency is something that is critical to our understanding of development. Again, every time I talk about these things as an anthropologist, I think, this is the most obvious thing you can think of. And you've got folks saying, oh, we've never heard this before, or we've heard it and we just didn't know what to do with it. And that's the exciting part, that people are very, very excited and interested in what we're trying to do. So as far as the culture piece goes, I wanted to say, with the capacity building, we've had modules within our agency, and we're trying to export it out to other agencies on Anthropology 101. What does it mean to understand culture? And I'll just give you a quick nugget on that, which is, in the past, our mission directors and most people working at USAID were former Peace Corps. Almost 70% and plus were former Peace Corps workers. That number has gone down significantly. It's gone down to the point where you've got folks that come in with just master's or higher degrees in international development. They're really good at programming. They're really good at program development and evaluation and management. They don't necessarily understand the value of culture. And this is what we've been processing through as an agency, but I'm really excited to say, after this Mission Directors Conference, we've got folks coming from missions saying, we want an anthropologist at our mission. So I'm writing a scope of work for anthropologists, which is fun for me because I can put as many people on the job in the field as possible that can support the work we do. But it also means that we can create the scope. So that was one idea that we had of putting folks out there. The other is just a key leader engagement person, an officer that would be in charge at each mission just to do the engagement. Because the excuse we get is we don't have time, right? We're so overrun with the bureaucracy, we just don't have the effort or the time. So let's put somebody out there that can do it. Something that's gone out to at State Department, and it's gone up to Secretary Clinton already, is to create community and interfaith outreach officer for critical posts and embassies that would also relate to USAID. So this is, like I'm saying, already in the works. It's already gotten to the point where we have a lot of buy-in for it. Just a couple of things I'm gonna throw out just as far as what we're doing, and then I'll appreciate any response you have. In terms of the global engagement piece, and this relates to the Cairo speech, and it's pretty fair to say that most of our agency folks that are here, as well as others, had a lot of input into the speech itself, because we had to make sure that whatever the speech said, we could do. Otherwise, we'd be in trouble if we couldn't get it actually done. So those deliverables you see in the speech, there might be about 12 of them, are the ones that we are working on specifically in each category. So you've got science and technology, you've got women empowerment, interfaith, and the entrepreneurship piece. So each of those pieces in the speech, we're actively engaged in figuring out how to do it. And the religious community engagement piece of that is part of the greater engagement we're trying to do with the president's mandate. So a lot of us that have been working on these things, I wouldn't say in isolation, but all by ourselves and then connecting with each other, we have this great boost from the president and from the White House to not just do it because it's a nice thing, but do it because it's the right thing to do. So this is a really exciting time for that. So it's a matter of changing the framework and changing the way people think about what engagement means. We talked about it being not counterterrorism. I still go into the field. I just came back from Mindanao, where folks in the weeds, many of them religious leaders, because that's whom I generally engage with, telling me, please stop making our programs be counterterrorism. I go back to the mission and Post and Embassy, and I said, hey, this is what they think. And they're saying, why do they think that? We don't say it is. I'm like, people are not stupid. People are not ignorant. People are very much savvy to what they are engaging with. And I think, the report outlines that very well. We're talking about people that are engaged with religion in such a way that they understand when a program is something that is going to try to deter them from either being more religious, which is not necessarily extremist, but it's going to affect them in that way. So it's an interesting dynamic of what people also perceive us to be. And that's a big piece of engagement. What we're trying to do further and more is create more venues for engagement and positive engagement. What we've been really, I think, pretty good at, whether it's USG in general or at least USAID, is engaging with religious leaders when we need a message put out. We've got a maternal health issue or a program. We need those religious leaders to give those in their sermons. So please do it and get it done so we can get our objective. It's true, and it's out there in the open. What we're trying to do is change that and say, instead of just engaging them when we need them, this is what the religious leaders in Afghanistan, actually, I've met with some mullahs from Tora Bora and from the outlying provinces, and they said to me point blank, they said, stop using us. Stop using us for messages, use us as people that are already doing things. So the question I asked them, what is it that you already do? What is your job? And what we did is we took what they said and translated it into development speak. So of course, as we know, they do conflict management and resolution, they do education, disputes. They're already doing development objectives. So what our push has been, let's treat them and engage with them as development practitioners, not necessarily just as religious leaders, because that makes people feel a bit better about it. So my general counsel folks were like, okay, as long as we can call them practitioners of development, maybe we can help ease the engagement. So that's fine. At this point, many of my colleagues and I in USG, and it's just a disclaimer, it's not something that we're trying to hide, is let's think about the terminology we use. And if it helps people to understand things in a different way, we'll take the effort and we'll be creative just to get the ends met. Finally, and I'll just throw a couple more things that we're trying to work on. One actually is we had an Indonesia-USA interfaith cooperation, it's a whole long title, building collaborative communities, enhancing cooperation among people of different faiths conference. It was last month, I think, and Quinn is here. That was State Department sponsored and organized with the with the Indonesian government. And again, it was interfaith, but it was about collaborative communities. We'll be having, at the end of March, Asia Regional Conference on Engaging Religious Leaders, it's another long title, on engaging religious leaders in sustainable development. We've got 14 countries in Asia that are participating, and what's really, for me, the most significant thing about that, it's not just bringing religious leaders together to talk about this. We're bringing to the table delegation from each country, which will consist of religious leaders, civil society head, but also USAID person / embassy person, some USG representative, and a government official from each of those countries. So you've got a delegation that if we can create a working group from that, they can go back and actually do some work, because these folks haven't been at a table before, so we're creating the space. So as long as USG can become a platform and create the space to have religious leaders engagement with those that are stakeholders, that's what we're pushing for. It's not about the religion, it's not about the issues themselves, but it's about creating that space. So we're very, very excited about that. The last thing that is in design phase, that again, I'm just putting these snapshots out for you, it really is in design phase because we're still thinking about it, is to create a center for excellence in culture and development. We'll have one in the Middle East and one in Asia. And idea behind this is much of what we are hearing as recommendations and much of what we really want to do, we don't necessarily, like I said, have the space or the time or the expertise to do. We've recognized that the gaps are there. What we're trying to do is create, for example, in this center, it would have a space for it, literally, it would be an institution, but it would also have collaborative partnerships with those that have the expertise and build that, and also be a clearinghouse for resources, and then finally be a training. So this will be a regional. So it really is more contextual to where these folks are, rather than having something too broad brushed to make sense in that region. So that's something else we're working on. I'm just looking at my notes, because a lot of what was exciting about the report for those of us that looked at it from USG was to say, these are almost the position papers we've been writing internally. And it's almost looking at it as a fantastic document to have to support what we've been trying to say and do in a way that obviously is coming from a great community of people that can push that forward and help us to do even further. But to understand that folks in the USG are trying to open their minds and their hearts, I'll say it. It gets a little soft for some people, but it really is trying to understand what we do and why we do it better. And I'll just give you this quick example about, I was out in the field where was I? In Cambodia, and I was meeting with some religious folks, and they said, well, what do you do? And I explained what USAID does. And this imam said, oh, you mean it's like zakat? And I thought about it, and it was a religious term. But what he did was took what we're trying to do and it converted. And then he further expressed it. He said, it's like an amana. Amana is a trust that you're given by God to take care of something. So his idea of what we're trying to do was, and I told him, I said, it's the American people's money, and we're responsible for how it's spent. And so the way that we spend it and the strategies we use is very important to us. So this was the conversation we're having back and forth, and he was using religious terms, I was using non-religious terms, but we understood each other. So these are the type of conversations that are being had, and that we are, trying not to pull back from. And the last thing I'll end with is I had a person in military in uniform say to me, and this is Afghanistan, he said, Afifa, what do I say when somebody asks me, do I believe in God? Because it happens. And I said, well, what do you mean? What do you say? Do you believe in God? He said, but I don't talk about my belief in God to anybody. It's private. It's me. I said, well, what happens when you don't answer the question? He said, well, they don't want to talk to me anymore. And this is after we talked about why engagement is so important. And finally, he said, well, I'm afraid if I say I don't believe in God, he's going to consider me an infidel and kill me on the spot. And that's why, and that was another reason he didn't want to say it. And I think that was a real reason, not just a private reason. So I told him, I said, you have to understand the fabric of these people's lives is not just religion is a part of it, but religion is the way they express who they are and the way they connect with one another. So finally he came back to me later, he said, what he told the mullah was, I don't know if I believe in God yet. And I said, well, what happened? Because you obviously didn't get killed, you're fine. He said, no, the mullah said, thank you for being honest. And inshallah, you will find the right answer. So the mullah didn't even condemn him. But after that, the conversation opened up to the point where these folks were having some genuine talks. And then we took it further and said, then how do we take that conversation and that engagement and do something positive for what the people themselves want? And then the question really becomes not just counterterrorism part, but what I'm really interested in as an anthropologist is going into a community and asking what's going on right. What's happening that's positive here that we can, if you want, help you to do it further and to keep it going and to sustain it, rather than going into a community and thinking that this is a very extremist community, it's all the negative things. So it's the questions that we ask and the way that we're engaging that we're trying to institutionalize. And when I give these scripts to people, they are so excited because these are the things they already want to say. And now we're trying to find ways to make it not just easier to say, but actually institutionalize even the way we say things. So the more help we have from all of you in the community of academics, in the community of activists and so on, really, having something like this and be able to say, hey, it's not just a few of us crazy people within the government, it's something that we're looking at holistically. I put that challenge, but I also put it out as a call for support. And for you to understand that there are internal conversations that you can tap into. Call one of us and find out what's going on. And then, it's a back and forth type of thing, because we'd love to have some of you come, and we were talking about, having the task force folks come and make their door-to-door rounds and come to the agencies and talk about this, but also talk about how they recognize that there's so much already, the potential is there because there's so much room for growth, and there's so many ways to go with it. I think I'll stop there, but I would be really happy to hear if anybody has, well, obviously for the whole discussion, but anything specific about what we're trying to do within the government. Thank you.
That was terrific.
Afifa, thank you. the audience assembled here has been very patient with us. You can tell there's a lot to discuss, and we're continuing to discuss it. But I hope you've gotten some sense into some of our discussions, at least. We do have roving mics, so if you can raise your hand and just introduce yourselves, many of you. So what I'm going to ask you, right here on the aisle here, Alia, we'll start here. So because we have a lot of questions, we're short of time. If you can direct your question to someone in particular on the panel, otherwise, as you know, will be the instinct. We will all answer every question. So please.
I'm from Jordan National Movement. My question is for any gentleman from the panels. In February 17, this month, there is an Al Jazeera satellite. They said they have polled the people in Middle East, 68%. They said they prefer someone, colonel, someone from power from outside, control them more than their leader. People in Middle East, they are tired from the dictators. Without make free speech, freedom over there, we can't make any engagement. Like the land, we can't put the seed if we not fix the land. We just waste our money in the United States over there. Yesterday in Jordan, just for reporter, journalists write articles, they criticize the prime minister. Today they go to the court. Any engagement should be with the freedom. Iraq now, people engage from the north to the south, Sunnah, Shia. They have the freedom. The people are not scared. If you scare the people, they cannot engagement. Also, the terrorists, they grow up when they grow up, the terrorists. They grow up when they have in the environment of the terrorists. They grow up when there is no freedom. There is no speech. They grow up under the ground. I am from Jordan. I know all the situation over there. All the terrorists, because people scared, they have planning. One guy, his name Rahil Gharaib from Brotherhood in Jordan. He just visited the United States. When he came back, Jordan intelligence put pressure, they not speak out. How we want to make engagement? People scared. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. This actually gets to exactly this tension, E.G., that I think you were bringing up in the report, of the challenge of balancing both engagement and working with authoritarian allies, but also the larger question on how do you engage when the environment of doing that is difficult. So that's a very tough question and right on point. I don't know if anybody, either of our chairs want to take it or one of the panelists to address it.
Don't speak at once. I'd be curious, actually, if one of you would, because it's the thing that I was struggling with in a report I admired so much.
I'll start by saying, simply to reinforce, to amplify what you said, which I took to mean that religious freedom is so important but so difficult, because there is such suppression of any kind of open dialogue or open discourse. And that's precisely what we're trying to address in the report. How do we move forward in a way that's a perfect example of an ally of the U.S. government that actually the reputation across the board is better than some other of our allies in terms of the role of religion and acknowledgement of religion in Jordan. The reputation is actually somewhat better, and yet here you're articulating challenges and problems, which is something that has to be directly addressed by developing the kind of robust presentation that a new ambassador on religious freedom would help to develop.
Right, go ahead. Richard, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, for those of you who are following it in the report, you can turn to page 43, which was the first of the 3 strategic challenges. So you can look for it there. Tony Blair's quoted, he says, "It's the most dangerous thing imaginable to force people to choose between an undemocratic elite with the right idea and a popular movement with the wrong one."
Right on the aisle there.
My name is Dr. John Holmes. I'm with the Association of Christian Schools International. We have member schools in 105 countries, so we understand some of these tensions, and we're very glad to have this paper released, and I'm looking forward to having some of our people interface with what the State Department and USAID is currently doing. I wanted to say two things. One to the USG, that I got a whole list of people that ought to be on your list to get a job because they understand this stuff. But for example, my brother-in-law, who has a PhD in cultural anthropology, and he trains pastors all over Africa, but nobody's ever asked him a question about this kind of stuff. I mean, I have, just because I'm interested. But I would just encourage interface between NAE and NCC, et cetera, so that some of these people that have the profound skills in that area, and if we get beyond the political games of, well, is he a D or an R? Is he Seventh-day Adventist because maybe that particular slot would fit? You know, whatever the game is, that's bad. I hate that. The other thing is, Richard, Dr. Cizik, when you said what you did about the evangelicals, you made my blood boil. But what I wanted to say was, isn't it interesting?
What part?
Oh, no. No, when you said that you wanted to make sure that evangelicals' relationship with Israel ought to be noted, and that can be firepower explosive. And I agree with you. But ironically, in the last few weeks, and I haven't followed real thoroughly, but I have heard some rumblings that the Knesset is trying to decide if they would give a special political recognition to evangelicals, even if they're not Jews, in Israel. And it's basically been shut down. But they're saying we owe American evangelicals that we would have some kind of work with those kind of people for years as a Baptist minister. So, you know, please.
Let me throw it back up to the panel because we've got a lot of people. Afifa, do you want to just talk about outreach?
Or offer his brother-in-law a job.
You can have my job. No, I think it's a good point because part of it is reaching out and engaging, and it's engaging all the way across every which way you can think of. And engagement means learning. A lot of what we've been doing lately, and it's, you know, whatever, however you want to phrase it, but we're calling them listening sessions, which is what they are. We bring a lot of people and we listen to what they have to say. And it's interesting because what we've been trying to do is get more people that are not the usual suspects or the usual folks that we do this with. And it's really been fascinating because, like, for this issue of cultural understanding, we are bringing in more people. Now, it may not mean that there are positions available, because partly the issue, as you know, with bureaucracy is just creating a position is not very fun and not very easy at all, but it is trying to at least engage them, you know, on a systematic way. So this has really affected, actually, the more of this engagement. If you know, looking at our country strategies, our country strategy for the work that we do now has been affected. And you can see it in the sense that people are looking, and the frame is, we need someone else to chime in on this issue. You know, we can't just go with this country strategy that we've been doing the same way over and over because it doesn't make sense. So reaching out to folks that can give us that expertise, I think there's more opportunity, there's more you know, knowledge base to do it. It's just in terms of giving people jobs straight up like that, it's just not going to be possible. But for example, in Afghanistan now, you know, we're ramping up there like crazy as far as recruitment. And one of the very big recommendations we've made internally and that we've been pushing is the type of people we hire. And the requirements have gone up. They have to have language. They have to have, you know, specifically some sort of understanding of the culture. So we're pushing, for example, Afghan Americans to come and apply, so that there's a much more connection to what, because they're going to be there for a year sometimes. So we want someone that can go there and have an effect within that year that makes a little bit of sense, because that doesn't make sense at all to be there for a year. But those are the kind of things that we're trying to do across the agency for USAID that I think is getting good response, but it's slow to move. It's a bureaucracy, and I was just telling my colleague that just dealing with how to write a memo in a bureaucracy it's not only time consuming, but it's frustrating. But anyway, that's just my gripe. But in terms of, you know, doing more engagement, I mean, like I said, if you all have connections or expertise and so on with this type of stuff, please send it to us, or please engage with us. You know, at the very least, we'll have you come in and do some briefings, which will really, believe it or not, have an effect. I've seen it, so that's why I'm sorry. I also just wanted to let you all know, I brought some copies of a brief that we put together, the role of religious leaders and communities in development efforts in Asia and the Middle East. So I don't know if I brought enough, but they're out here. I would encourage you to take them. They're just a quick synopsis of the programs that have engaged, and I'd love to get your feedback.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask to be very short and sweet because there's so many questions. Back there, the woman right there, yeah, next to the man in the red sweater.
Hi, I'm Joni Feingold. I'm a former Foreign Service officer and a PhD student now at George Mason University, adjunct instructor. I have two questions, but hopefully both can be answered very succinctly, or choose not to answer one if you like. My first question is, it's been a dozen years since IRFA. Why, and I guess I'll direct this towards either Scott or Richard, why has it not been seen as truly successful? And then the second question I have is, this idea of religious freedom is often perceived, and I don't think wholly incorrectly, as a very Protestant idea, a very American idea, because in other religious traditions, religion isn't seen as a choice. It's seen as something you're born to, a truth, et cetera, your particular religion. So how can State Department officials or the U.S. government or any of us engage in a way to talk about religious freedom without feeling giving the sense that we're imposing a particular view of religion, as it were? And again, I think Scott probably would be the best person to answer that. I'm not sure.
I'll start at least. That's a very complicated, that last question is very complicated. Of course, the easy way out, which I'll take, is religious freedom is more than about conversion or proselytism. So religious freedom is more broad. It's also freedom for groups that have no choice in that sense that you just described, to have influence and a voice within the public square, and certainly that can't be lost when we try to address the very difficult question of choice and whether a religion identity is given, formal, final, that's it. One way to think about it, though, is to go back to the comments on globalization and fluidity and change, and recognize that there's a lot of internal contestation on questions like this from within the traditions. So that's also a place where, you know, USG, or for that matter, American-related, U.S.-related non-governmental organizations don't have to settle every issue in every situation. There has to be a very detailed. That's why the religious literacy and local knowledge has to be front and center. On your first question, I'll start, and then others, maybe Richard or someone else wants to say. I think one of this is a longer complication of why hasn't IRFA been more successful, hasn't been perceived to be more successful. And I think one of the from what I've heard, there are people like Tom Farr and others in the room who know the details of these questions better. IRFA was never fully well integrated, perhaps, into the range of State Department offices, and may have been perceived as imposed from outside. How do we understand this? And that's one of the things, without being quite that explicit about it, that the task force would hope can get settled. We don't offer particular prescriptions of how to move that forward, but how do we have the Ambassador for Religious Freedom more fully integrated, so that the status of that office is commensurate with the status of other special envoys and ambassadors, and how that would be one way to make that a much more effective office than it has been. But there are probably other things that could be said, but that's enough for me right now.
Thank you. Right up here.
My name is Ali Abu Zakuk from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, a network of Democrats in the Arab world. I am one of the people who work in the field, and I have seen the problems from U.S. policy in dealing with Muslim organizations or Muslim groups in the area. There is a taboo for us to even teach members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt democracy or democratization process, even from the project that DRL has supported us for it. There is a taboo in the State Department, a policy taboo. That is something that needs to be changed, especially for groups that are, maybe you have said it there. The question, another one, and also I have studied and worked with the religious freedom, agendas and the religious freedom reports. There is a perception in the Arab world and the Muslim world in particular that you side with the minorities and forget about the religious freedom of the majorities. How many people know that mosques in Egypt are closed, only times of prayers? Churches are not. It's a shocking information when somebody told me that. But that is something which we need to revisit our policy and put the universal values of our Constitution, democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, to be part of our policy when we deal outside.
Just quick, you'll be pleased with the report then, because we have the authoritative writ here. Richard has it. I don't know if he's got the place, but we really do emphasize majority, not just minorities. That's one of the problems for all. That's very much a key theme in our report.
Okay.
You can also look at the citation vis-a-vis the Brotherhood on page 44, in which the U.S. government broke off contact with the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 90s following objections from President Mubarak.
And I think back to Scott's point, there was a lot of work on stressing the majorities as well as the minorities for exactly that reason. The woman here in the green blazer has been waiting.
This is for Afifa, and I'm Dr. Marianne Kuzumana-Love at Catholic University, and I'm at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom this year on sabbatical. We've had this discussion, Afifa and I, already, but the point that you raised about bureaucracy and being a personal gripe is not. It's actually a very important point. And I wanted to ask you to clarify for the audience a bit about the scale of your projects, because while all of the initiatives you discussed are very important and very much in the spirit of this task force report, the Religion and Global Affairs Initiative, the outreach efforts and the activities that you've been sponsoring, the pilot projects and the pilot trainings, they're not institutionalized. And the problem is that I'd like to ask you the scale. So you are one person for all of USAID. The religious liaison positions that you're fighting to get accepted would be a pilot project of 5 or 6 in 2 years, if we're lucky and if that goes forward. So how can you further institutionalize? You need all of our help. You need all of us to be on board for the activities that you're already doing. I think it's great that the way you're reaching people through non-mainstream channels, but the mainstream channels are not helping right now. 450 courses at the Foreign Service Institute, only 2 talk about religion. Both are Islam. One is Islam in Iraq, one is Islam in the former Soviet Union. Both are electives, not core courses. So how can you move that institutionalization and the scale ball forward?
Afifa, can you just hold on to that question in your head? What I'd like to do is, because we are going to run out of time, there's so many questions, I'm going to take a few and then ask the panel to run down in the answer. So if you can maybe just jot that down about scale and institutionalization. It's a great question that I want to come back to. So the woman in the brown sweater right there.
Kathy Cosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I wanted to commend you, of course, for the report, but also to point out that there are a few things that I wanted to draw your attention to. One being the resources of the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has placed freedom of religion or belief as a very important part of its core activities, not only in the field, but also institutionally. They have an excellent informal staff of advisors, leading lawyers on freedom of religion or belief. Also, to ask a question about societies like Uzbekistan, which I notice is mentioned in the report, where religion is increasingly playing a role, but coming out of societies where religion, obviously, under the Soviets, was extremely discouraged, to put it mildly, and official versions of the religion were encouraged. So I think that's also important to call attention to countries like that with sort of that nuanced context. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman in the red tie right to your right there has been waiting.
Thank you. My name is Anwar Hadam. I'm with the Movement for Liberty and Social Justice in Algeria. One of those who have been denied office because of this religious thing. I would like to ask you, or to raise a point concerning, we have to be realistic. And in time of war, all this effort will be, undermined if we are not really engaging seriously religion and have some religious rule of engagement. Directly to the point, and here I will talk about religion with the capital R. That is, in each and every religion we have that humanist dimension. that is missing in our conflicts. Because nations differ, nations have conflict of interest, nations, of course, they get into war. But the problem is we are forgetting that our enemies are also human beings. So I don't know whether if you had addressed this issue, that would be very helpful to review religion when it comes to definition of terrorism, to remind everybody, and also when it comes to issue of torture, issue of violation of human rights, that human being, that person that you are torturing is a human being. And so how will you see the interaction of religion in this read? Because in time of war, if you're not really serious about this, all this effort which I really support will be really undermined. People will be always having in mind the Abu Ghraib, the 9/11 from the other side, etc. So we need really to have this issue tackled seriously.
I like your term on the religious rules and engagement. Sir, I believe you've done a lot of work on this, and I think it's when we should come right back to you on this
Alan
to pick up on that.
Hersky, and I wanted to raise the issue of the Establishment Clause again, and I think the problematic, and here's my question. The question is how can we ensure that if we accept the Establishment Clause applies internationally, that we will get it right? Because in fact, it is a hugely contested issue here in the United States, and as a number of scholars have noted, establishment case law is a mess. And so if establishment case law is a mess here, how in the world can we expect and anticipate and hope that our ambassadors and others will pick the right case law to apply when the Supreme Court can't figure it out? I mean, I just think it's a hugely problematic and dangerous precedent to say the Establishment Clause restricts our ability to operate abroad. We couldn't have supported Christian democracy. Some of the things that FIFA might want to do might be interpreted by some as violating the Establishment Clause. I just think it's a bridge we should not cross.
Alan, the ink is not dry yet if you want to sign the dissent.
So we're going to
use the word, Alan, we do use the word prudent. And the key challenge, you see, is for the U.S. to act in a way that is both decisive and prudent.
I'm just reminded, can I just, of something John DiIulio said when he ran the faith-based office. He said, in the United States, we don't really take anything seriously until we go to court about it, so sue me, he said. And, you know, I can't imagine that this work would go on as it should without generating some litigation somewhere. And I guess I thought the majority, by trying to keep this issue out of, you know, we're Americans, so we're going to argue about the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause. I thought the majority was trying to say there is a whole lot of stuff we can do without getting into litigation or these problems. And then I think it was inevitable that given the argument we have, you would have the two dissents because there are such passionate views about what these mean. But I saw the report itself as highly pragmatic on these questions, which I actually think is commendable.
So let me do this. There's a lot of people jumping in on exactly this point, so it's something we're not going to resolve. But I don't want to lose sight of the questions and the comments that have been asked. So I think to move down the panel, and we probably will run out of time by the end, but to take on, either continue on the kind of conversation about what are the religious rules of engagement, how do we engage on human rights, touching on the issues of the Establishment Clause, which we spend a lot of time in the report talking about. Other things on the table are the post-Soviet space and maybe different logics and dynamics happening there, European involvement on OSCE, and really something that this report has really grappled with, scale and institutionalization. I will just kind of throw out there as a lead on this. In the very beginning, when we started organizing this report, we were at attention about how to acknowledge the things happening in the U.S. government that we, as a task force, endorsed, and still be able to say there is not yet a whole of government approach. It is not institutionalized. If not ad hoc and episodic, it's isolated here and there. And I think what FIFA is talking about is exactly this process of moving forward. Maybe there was 2 steps backwards, but now moving forward in this kinds of engagement. But the report at base urges a continuation in this direction, both because another issue that the task force really did grapple with, religion is not just a problem, but in fact, many of the opportunities, the development work that Catherine Marshall's been spent so much time working on, a lot of the engagement, a lot of the positive opportunities are very much the flip side of this coin. And if we can understand that, we can probably have a more pragmatic and healthy conversation, because we don't go into it starting with a problem. Rather, we go in saying there is good and ill, there's opportunities and challenges, and how do we move in this world and in a way that can in many ways help us, help others, help us back. So with that, I will run down the panel to either address these questions or make any last comments. And what I might do is do it in reverse order. I will start with Afifa, go to EJ, now I'm lost a little bit, go to Scott, and Richard, let you have the last word. So Afifa.
Sure, thank you. The question about scalability, or even just scale, and then institutionalizing is something that, I mean, it's an obvious grappling issue, because what I hear many times is, oh, Afifa, that's a great idea, but we tried it. We had anthropologists here. And in fact, when I met with the mission directors, I said, so, how many of you are anthropologists? And a bunch of them put their hands up. So, yes, I mean, it is attitudinal, it is behavior, it is frame, all those things that I'm talking about is what we're trying to affect. But in the end, if you don't have folks that can do it, and then you don't have the systems in place, it's for sure, it's an issue. So the types of things that I'm talking about that we're doing, yes, some of them are pilots, but in the end, also what it's been said to me explicitly, if I don't see it working, I'm not going to believe in it. And this is bureaucratic speak. You've got folks that have only been in USG and have never been out of it. And those of us that come from the outside, we know there's another way to do things, or there's another, and it's an uphill battle. I've had many friends that have taken it maybe for a year, 2 years, and they're out as far as bureaucracy. And it's totally understandable, because you're trying to affect change. You're trying to make things work. And the sad thing about it, I guess, is to say that it's not that people are against the idea, and they're not against change. It's just creating those spaces where it can happen. I'll just give you a quick example about institutionalizing. For example, we do contracting as an agency, right? And we've heard all about how terrible that is. And in fact, a lot of the recommendations we've been making from the work that we do is we need to look at who we contract with. We want to do more in-country NGOs, for example. So we have all these great discussions with NGOs. We want to go directly to them. But in the end, what is the funding mechanism we have in place? The funding mechanism we have in place is to fund such and such and so, meaning they fit the criteria. I mean, can you imagine the discussion, which is, we've got to do it better, we've got to do it different, we want to do it, but then it's how? Mechanism. For example, Afghanistan and Pakistan especially, I mean, that's a very unique situation now. We don't want to do the same thing we did in Iraq. I mean, everybody, is quite frank about what the issues were there as far as contracting. So we want to do things differently. So it's sitting down, I mean, for example, for the work that I do, sitting down with our Global Development Alliance, sitting down with folks that work with NGOs and funding mechanisms, and trying to literally create a new mechanism. And that's the tougher part of it. But institutionalizing these other things, for example, the religious engagement piece, this conference we're having, it's a big to-do, and everybody's really excited, but I'm trying to keep it as working level and as real as possible. I don't want it to go into public diplomacy, as much as I love those folks. I don't want it to become a photo op, because the idea behind it, and it's not just me, it's the people that are engaged on this. This is real work. We need these folks to come up with an agenda, and they want to do it, so that we're creating the space. So essentially what I'm saying is, if this works, this Religious Leaders Conference, it will do a couple of things. One is identify what folks are already doing in the ground, religious leaders specifically, and what they can do more with what they have. So that's going to create an institutional shift in understanding that something's already happening. Now, next year, we're hoping to have the same conference in the Middle East, and then take it to Eurasia, and so on and so forth. It's not the conference itself that I'm selling here. What I'm trying to get across to myself and then to the folks that we work with, and I think, again, we're able to do it because people want to, is what do you do with that activity that can institutionalize? So creating these positions, for example, as an anthropologist, I'm writing a scope of work for one specific position at one specific mission right now. If that position is created, there's an institutionalized factor, right? And so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, you're right. For example, the community outreach officers that we talked about, yes, they're for 5 or 6 within the next 2 years. But we were so happy we got that. We're like, yeah, now we can move forward with this. It's not great scale. No, it's not all the missions at all. And it's frustrating, but at the same time, knowing now what we know, which is things move at that pace, even to have that is fantastic. To have an interfaith working group now, we moved from there and so on and so forth. And the other thing about, and I know the recommendation is to keep it at NSC, and they would create the framework. That is something, it's an ongoing discussion. Where should this sit? And should it sit somewhere? Or should it be the way we do business? So these are, even for this position on anthropologists, some folks have told me that's not a good idea. Because if you have one anthropologist who's responsible for all the cultural knowledge of the mission, it's going to mess up because people say it's his job or her job to do it. And that's not what we want. We want everyone to think like this. I want to turn everybody into an anthropologist. But those are the internal discussions we have. Where would it sit? Where does it make sense? And yes, at some point it might be, it's just too complicated, let's forget it. That would be the sad thing. But institutionalizing means where does it make sense? Where can we have it? The Religion and Global Affairs Working Group that we already have with my colleagues from state, it's not a big to-do. It's not a huge, activity. But on a regular basis, we have these great fora with madrasa heads from Pakistan or from, who else have we had come? We've had some really interesting characters that come through that we get to talk with. Is that institutionalizing? I think so. I think it's creating the space that we on a regular basis we can respond to. So yes, scale is an issue. Yes, sustainability is also an issue. But the more people we can convert, through this process to whatever we're trying to do here, I think that's really the goal, is to change attitudes, and attitudes go a long way within these structures.
Afifa, thank you. In the 3 minutes we have left,
Sorry.
DJ, let me turn it back.
I'm going to be very quick. 2 points quickly. I really appreciated the question from the woman about whether these ideas of human rights and religious liberty are fundamentally Protestant. I always say all Americans, including atheists, are in some sense Protestant. We're all affected by that culture. But I do think there is a need, and this is why I was so struck by this sentence of the report, to fight the charge that these commitments are a form of American cultural or Protestant imperialism. And I think there is an assumption that these notions of religious liberty and human rights related concepts are fundamentally secular, liberal, and capitalist. And I think we need to revisit the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and that whole process after World War II. When you think about Eleanor Roosevelt, Marianne Glendon wrote about this so well, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jacques Maritain, these human rights were not simply rooted in secular principles. There is a universality. And as some of the questioners suggested, anyone who has experienced oppression in any form realizes the urgency of declaring these universal standards. Now, as I said, I don't pretend the U.S. government can't enforce all these standards, but it can be part of a process to create a consensus. The other thing I want to say is we talk so much about, we use words like government bureaucrats, and we sort of talk about the failure of our government. I listened to Afifa, and I was really proud of our government, and somebody should pay to put Afifa on the road. So people understand that our government is doing a lot of very interesting things, and there are a lot of people who work for it who are deeply committed, deeply thoughtful, and I just wanted to thank you for the work you do.
And Afifa, I get the sense that your kids aren't looking for even greater space between you and them.
They're teenagers, so they want a lot.
Maybe they are then.
Good luck.
Scott.
I just will pick up and amplify again what EJ's first point, and also, of course, the second. But the first point I'll tie to the question the gentleman had about torture, and one way to open up on the question of universal standards, universal human rights, and so on. One of the things the report talks about in some length is the agency of religious actors in peace-building, conflict transformation, also in human rights work that has largely been overlooked. And as you pointed out, these particular religious traditions do have, in their own particular language and symbols and rituals, expressions of values that are held more deeply in common than we recognize. I'm not denying that there's some incommensurability there too, that there's some values that are not shared more broadly. But we haven't begun yet to create what Bill Vinley years ago used the term second order or bridging discourse, by which he meant who's with Religions for Peace, World Conference on Religion and Peace, the notion that we need to find a way to talk across these divides, but preserve the deep resonance on questions of what we would call human rights or fundamental human values, because there's a lot more common ground than we've recognized, because our process has not been to go there. It's been to shy away from that. And so how do we get into a kind of a mutual shared discourse in which we can feel at home with our own fundamental religious values or cultural values, and yet reach out for where that common ground is? That's a very important part, and we're just beginning to kind of think about what that might mean, not just governmentally, but non-governmentally as well.
Richard?
It was once said, can't recall by whom, that the 21st century will be religious or will not be at all. Excuse my cold, but the 21st century will be religious or it will not be at all. That frightens secularists. They scream bloody murder. But the reality is that by 2050, according to surveys and the rest, the combined impact of the four largest religions will reach 80%. That's significantly down, for example, from a figure of 67% in 1990, 73% in 2005, and 80% by 2050. Well, that's the reality of the rising impact of religion around the world. And I think that policymakers would be well advised, I think, to listen to all of you and to the report and others and take note.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you first for coming out today. You have the hot off the Kinko's press version of our report. In about 2 weeks, there'll be a proper hardbound report. If we can be of service of getting that report to you for your networks, please don't hesitate to contact us. We are more than happy to do that. If you give us, you can pull it off the web now, but it'll look a little nicer in a couple of weeks. I want to do a few things. I want to thank the panelists very much for giving up their precious time. Up a few more. I want to thank the task force members who are here. The co-chairs in particular, again, for Scott and Richard for doing such a great job. You for being here, and really, again, to the Berkley Center for all of your support in our efforts today. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.